A very warm welcome to this Refugee Law Initiative Conference thematic panel session on, I have the wrong title here, apologies, on community sponsorship. Yes, the role of community sponsorship for refugee resettlement in Australia with a state responsibility. My name is Professor David Cantor and I'm stepping in as the chair as unfortunately our programme chair is unwell at the present time. In this panel, we're going to be presenting the legal and policy background of past and current community refugee sponsorship programmes in Australia and introduce the new Australian Research Council project on community sponsorship. The panellists are focusing on how sponsorship partnerships have been or are conceived and implemented in the context of Australia, and they go on to consider the opportunities for community sponsorship in Australia to contribute to the integrity of the global refugee regime by examining such questions as what models of public-private partnership, past and present, including legal and policy framings, have been implemented and tested in Australia, and how is refugee protection conceived and enacted by community actors and sponsors under the Australian models, and what theories of partnership and community participation underpin these actions. Finally, what are the broader implications of community sponsorship in Australia to refugee protection on the one hand and to state responsibility on the other? And you can find full details of the 4 papers and presenters that make up this panel in your conference programme. Our speakers today will start us off by presenting key perspectives on these 4 quite different components of the issue, after which we're going to open up for broader discussion, questions and comments from other participants. Each of the 4 speakers on the panel will have 10 minutes for their presentation, which I'll be enforcing strictly. During the session, please do pose your own questions and comments to the speakers by typing them into the chat box on Zoom. And after speakers have finished their presentations, there'll be time for them to discuss and reflect on your questions and comments. And of course, speakers are very welcome to pose questions to one another as well. The session is being recorded and will be posted to the RLI website as a podcast. So if you don't wish to appear in the podcast, please leave the session now. Without further ado, in that case, we turn to our very first speaker. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Anthea Vogel from the University of Technology, Sydney, Australia, who will be speaking to the title of At What Cost? Private Sponsorship of Humanitarian Entrance in Australia. Over to you, Dr. Vogel.
Thanks so much, David, and also to the conference organisers. I have shared my screen, so I hope everyone can see that before I begin. Excellent. It's a pleasure to be here today, or more accurately tonight, for all of our panellists. And before I begin, I wanted to acknowledge that I am presenting from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in Sydney and Australia, and that sovereignty over this land hasn't been ceded. In this short presentation, my role on the panel today is to give a quite high-level overview of Australia's introduction of private sponsorship programs, and I want to place the current and planned sponsorship schemes within their relatively recent historical context. My co-panellists will address different and the other longer aspects of this history, and Susan in particular will discuss the funded project on which we are all collaborating. In the interest of time, I'm going to jump straight into Australia's current sponsorship programs. And it is fair to say, as an introduction, that it has been something of a stop and start affair in relation to private sponsorship in Australia, with some of the stopping, of course, due to COVID-19 and its effects on humanitarian programs across the globe. But some of the false starts have also been due to the particular context of sponsorship in the Australian program, and as will become clear, problems with the design of the Australian programs themselves. So, while Australia's contemporary programs are relatively recent and are often discussed as such, the original pilot in Australia began almost 10 years ago, which is a shock for some of us working on it to realise. The Community Proposal Pilot, or CPP, ran from 2013 to 2017 and was Australia's first program for the full private sponsorship of humanitarian entrance by individuals, businesses or community organisations. So the program provided for up to 500 places, but those places were taken from within the offshore component of Australia's humanitarian program. That is, the places were not in addition to the existing annual government quotas for humanitarian entrance and did not meet what is generally referred to in the literature as the principle of additionality. From the outset, the program design was controversial. it was certainly out of step with existing private sponsorship programs, not simply because of the absence of this principle of additionality, but because of the jaw-droppingly high cost of sponsoring an applicant. So the pure visa application for one applicant in Australia was approximately 19,000 Australian dollars and approximately 30,000 Australian dollars for a family. So those application charges were before the costs of resettlement are factored in that all sponsors were required to cover, and the visa application charges were not used directly to cover the cost of sponsorship. So that was funding that flowed to the Australian Department of Immigration. The estimated cost that both the pilot program and the permanent program that followed it for sponsors to sponsor an entire family would be about 100,000 Australian dollars. And to give some sense of comparison here, the Canadian program for a similar size family would cost about 30,000 Canadian dollars. Additionally, applications to the department could only be made by mediating NGOs, which were known within the Australian program as approved proposing organisation. This, of course, represented a further layer of outsourcing and privatisation within the sponsorship program. But significantly, the APOs charged an additional fee for their services in preparing an application. So this was a further approximately $11,000, depending on the NGO participating. And again, this was in addition to departmental fees and the costs of living that sponsors were required to cover. The pilot was only intended to run for 4 years. And in 2015, the government conducted a public review of the CPP. Many of the responses, for reasons I've outlined, were incredibly critical of the program and suggested sensible and reasonable changes to bring the Australian sponsorship program in line with other programs that were operating. In previous work with Khan Huang, who's also on the panel, and Asher Hirsch, we have traced how the CPP and the CSP, which followed it, were explicitly characterised as revenue-raising measures by the Australian government. So the Liberal Turnbull government at the time noted that an advantage of private sponsorship and refugee sponsorship was that this model of sponsorship minimises cost to governments. And then further in the government's own budget estimates, the government openly projected that a permanent sponsorship program would provide a net revenue gain to government. So, and specifically that it would provide about $27 million over the first 4 years of its implementation. This brings us to the rollover from the pilot program into what was called the Community Support Program, which I've referred to as the CSP. So the CSP came into being in 2017, and it's good to get a sense of the response to the CPP before that. And I think the community, expert and sector response to the existing CPP in Australia is best summarised as an almost uniform critique of the program and the terms on which it was introduced, alongside very enthusiastic support for the idea of private sponsorship as such. So there was a huge uptake of the CPP despite its limitations, and demand for the program outstripped supply quite significantly. However, due to the barriers to engaging in sponsorship, a key critique of Australia's first sponsorship program was that it was operating as a de facto family reunion program with no broader community involvement in refugee sponsorship as such. So in some interviews I have conducted with the APOs that I mentioned, the organisations confirmed that 90% of sponsors were really families living in Australia using the program to bring their own family members in situations of immediate risk to safety. And this took place, and indeed takes place, in the absence of a functional family reunion pathway for refugees living in Australia. Despite all of these concerns and critiques about the CPP, when the government introduced the CSP in 2017, it more or less mirrored the pilot program, and with some changes, some of which certainly weren't positive or well received. So one thing that the government did do was increase the annual quota of places to 1,000 places per annum, still from within the offshore humanitarian intake, the existing humanitarian intake. But the government also introduced, the Australian government at the time also introduced a new set of restrictive and additional criteria for people being sponsored. So without going into too much detail on my slide here, you can see the additional criteria for eligibility for sponsorship included that a humanitarian entrant be aged between 18 and 50, have adequate English, and have a job offer, or so already a job offer in Australia, or the skills to enable them to acquire a job quickly. What we can see here is the overall profile of an eligible applicant confirms the explicitly exclusionary nature of the Australian program, and that it simply was not designed as a matter of priority to resettle the most vulnerable or most at risk refugees, or indeed those just who ordinarily fit within the definition of a humanitarian applicant. Those who are not job ready, those who are over 50 or without language skills are simply not viable candidates for sponsorship under the Australian program. There are, of course, gendered implications in the criteria here. The job ready requirement means that female-headed households and those with major care responsibilities are very much less likely to qualify as primary applicants. Cost, of course, continue to be an immense disincentive for community participation under the CSP, as with the CPP. So where does all that leave us? Through this history, there has been absolutely concerted community and NGO engagement with improving sponsorship programs and engaging in the introduction of sponsorship in Australia. The government did indeed, in response to some of these critiques, commit to undertaking a review of the CSP in late 2019, and its own internal and quite critical review of the CSP led to a report being delivered in March of 2021. So you can see it's relatively recent action in relation to sponsorship in Australia here. This report and other factors led to a further pilot program, and that pilot program is the Community Refugee Integration and Settlement Pilot, or the CRISP, as it's referred to. And the CRISP was set to operate in addition to the CSP. The CRISP was announced in December 2021, and also very recently, and since then, as some people may know, and certainly the panelists know, we've had a change of government in Australia from the Liberal Party to the Conservative Liberal Party to the current Labor Party. The new government has confirmed its support for the CRISP and also its support for community sponsorship as such, and has also announced that they will gradually increase the number of people coming in under the community sponsorship program in Australia to 5,000 people per annum. Though at this stage, and we're relatively early in the new government, very little other detail has been announced. Under the CRISP, though, it's interesting to note, and you can see from my slide here, the government intends to partner with one key NGO, the Community Refugee Sponsorship Australia organisation, or CRESA, to develop a program that will settle about 1,500 humanitarian entrants over 4 years. And under it, and interestingly, sponsorship will be undertaken only by community groups, faith groups, or trained volunteers, and the only humanitarian entrants who will come in under the program will be those who are UNHCR referred. So this is again connecting to a big theme in the literature around who is sponsored and on what terms, and the CRISP program is limited to those who the UNHCR have referred as humanitarian entrants. To finish up, I want to note a couple of things. First, and I think it's come through in this presentation, that the CPP and the CSP really are exceptional in the context of other sponsorship programs, and they raise unique questions about the nature of citizen engagement in refugee resettlement and the boundaries of what we call private sponsorship. And that's something that Susan will be picking up on in her talk. At what point does private sponsorship move into something that doesn't look like a solution, or something that provides a durable solution in refugee resettlement? While there is a lot more to say in the analysis of these programs, I'll end by saying that central to our project is the idea that Australian practice is significant to both shaping the normative understanding of community sponsorship vis-a-vis refugee resettlement as such, and also that this work is important in the context of really fast-moving introduction of sponsorship programs in other states, and in line with the kind of recommendation and encouragement under the Global Compact. This is a great moment to hand over, back to the chair and over to Khan, who will present a much longer history of community sponsorship in Australia.
Many thanks indeed, Dr. Vogel. I think that's a great presentation to lead us off, really gives us a clear sense of kind of the lie of the land, and raises, as you say, some really important questions about normative understandings and the extent to which, or the implications that a model like that in Australia has for other countries, thinking about principles, as you suggested, like additionality, thinking about the context of, for example, lack of family reunion pathways that you highlighted as something that this sort of fills in for something else that perhaps should be there already. So really, really great start. Many thanks indeed, Dr. Vogel. Our second speaker, moving immediately on, is Kanoan, who is from the University of New South Wales, Australia. And Khan will be inviting you to speak to your title of Lessons from History, the Community Refugee Settlement Scheme. Over to you. You are on mute, so you may wish to unmute.
There we go. Can you see my screen okay? Great. I'll just get on to presentation mode and then I'll be away. All right. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to come and speak to you today about the Community Refugee Settlement Scheme. As Anthea has noted, it might seem as though the flurry of community sponsorship activities in Australia over the past few years suggests that it's a relatively new policy area, but in fact, community refugee sponsorship has a long history in Australia, and Australia has a rich history of community sponsorship settlement. And a big part of that is the Community Refugee Settlement Scheme, which ran from 1979 to 1997. In my PhD, which I'm finishing up now at the Caldor Centre, I've basically conducted some quite extensive archival research into this scheme, complemented by some interviews with some key informants, including people that previously worked on administering the scheme within the Australian government. So what I want to do today is give you a quick, I guess, tour of the scheme from its inception until it was de-established in 1997, and really try and give you a sense of what were the strengths and weaknesses of this particular scheme and what can we learn from it in terms of contemporary policy making. So if we have a look at the overview of the CRWS on this timeline, we can see that it was first established in 1979 as part of Australia's response to the Indo-Chinese refugee crisis. And the CRWS was established at a time when Australia was really formulating some of its resettlement policies and programs, as well as the formulation of some of our settlement programs for migrants and refugees as well internally. And the scheme was set up essentially to allow the government to quickly move refugees away from government, what were then called government, sorry, I've just lost my train of thought there. Give me 1 second. Sorry, I've just had a bit of a mind blank. So the scheme was set up in 1979, and sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought here. So it was set up in 1979 and it rapidly expanded in 1985. By which point some 11,570 refugees have been settled under the CRWS with 500 registered sponsorship groups. And the way in which the sponsorship scheme operated was that there were sponsorship groups who had to apply to the Australian government to be a sponsor and undertook to provide settlement responsibilities for 12 months. And that covered everything from accommodation, accommodation supports for that whole 12-month period. And sorry, I've just completely blanked out.
Can you say something about how the people were chosen?
Yes. Sorry, if I could just have a minute. Maybe, Kate, maybe if you could start and then I'll come back. Sorry.
Would you like me to move on to our next speaker, who I think is...
yes, if I could just come back, please, that would be okay.
Of course. In that case, Professor Susan Kneebone, as our third speaker on the panel, we welcome you from Melbourne University, Australia, and your title for the presentation is Alternative Framings of Community, Partnerships and Protection in Refugee Sponsorship Programs. So you have the floor.
Thank you. I think I need to ask Khan to stop sharing his screen. Yeah,
Sorry.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So thank you, David, and thank you, Anthea, for an excellent introduction. I'm actually speaking from Hobart, and I'm not sure what the traditional owners group here is, but I acknowledge the traditional owners. I've actually been in touch with Tamara, and I will see her after this. But thank you very much to the RLI for allowing us to present. So I will present today on, here, I will share my screen. Share, just a moment. Yes, here we are. We will just get that away. We will get on to, just move that away. We want to start the slideshow here. Apologies. Okay, now we're with it. Okay, so the title of my talk is Alternative Framings of Community Partnerships and Protection in Refugee Sponsorship Programs. And as Anthea has already foreshadowed, this is a new project which I am leading with Anthea and Kate, and we did hope that Khan would come in with us, but he's a little busy finishing off his PhD, but he's given us an enormous amount of help on this program. And as Anthea mentioned, we are very concerned to explain that the Australian model does have some flaws and raises a lot of questions. We are concerned that Australia is often seen as a model for refugee policy, and this is a good occasion on which to show a thorough analysis of our program. So we have 4 key objectives in our project, and these are the 4 projects which are better explained on the next slide, which include looking at the history of refugee resettlement post-World War II, whereas Khan is looking at a particular period. We will be looking right back to the beginning of Australia's experience with resettlement, and in particular at relations between the community and the Immigration Department as it developed policy. We will be questioning many of the ideas that people have about Australia's policies and showing that they're much more nuanced than we expect. We will be comparing and evaluating the policy, institutional and regulatory frameworks in Australia with other jurisdictions in order to suggest. But more importantly, we do have a strong theoretical component in our project, which will look at the theories of community citizenship and protection, which are underlying the project. And finally, we will recommend legal and policy measures for broader community participation. So this is a fascinating and multifaceted project, which we can look at it at many different levels. And so in the time that I have, I will try to explain to you what the main features of our inquiry is. So there are 3 key dimensions to our project. First of all, we, as Anthea's already foreshadowed, want to look at the role of the state in refugee resettlement, as well as the meaning of refugee protection and the role of the community. In jumping right to the end of the presentation that I'm giving and the message that I want to convey, what our real concern is that refugee resettlement is no longer being thought of as a durable solution, but as something which, as Anthea's examples show, is a means of state fulfilling migration needs in different ways. And we want to argue that, in fact, refugee protection is something that needs to be protected, that it needs to be distinguished from complementary pathways for all the reasons that we know are important, and many of which were outlined by Jane McAdam in the keynote tonight. So these are some of the key tensions, I guess, that we can point to and that we will be exploring and examining through the literature, through empirical work, through comparison of frameworks in other jurisdictions, the idea of the tension between refugee resettlement and state sovereignty, the idea that basically refugee protection is a state responsibility, that there are tensions created when the state starts to hive off some of that activity to parts of the community. And essentially, this boils down in practice to the idea of permanent versus temporary solutions, and the fact that durable solutions are often needed for people. The distinctive status of the refugee, we argue, is something that needs to be protected. So the role of the community, looking beyond family and ethnic sponsorships, as Anthea explained, the current official programs, as distinct from the CRISP UNHCR selected program, which was explained, is in fact a de facto family reunion sponsorship, and a very, very expensive one. I remember hearing from one former refugee who Masha Hirsch organised for me to meet, who explained how he and his wife had worked for 2 years in 2 jobs to get the money to bring out their family from a war-torn part of Africa. And these were people who should have been entitled to, they in every way met the criteria of Australia's public humanitarian program. So you can see that these are the tensions that you introduce when you introduce community sharing. So whilst there are often views expressed very widely in the general literature about how good community sponsorship is for the community and how it might change the broader public's views on refugees, these changes often come at a considerable trade-off. So we will be considering what democratic and humanitarian rationales underlie these, with the competing and rationales, in accordance with principles of, for example, distributive justice, not to exclude other possibilities, but fundamentally asking the question of whether community sponsorship leads to better refugee protection. So that was the second tension. And then the third tension, which I think is a really important one, and again, the example that Anthea gave of the latest version of the Australian public program show this point. Resettlement seems to be considered as a complementary pathway. So there is this fundamental question of what is humanitarian protection? Is community resettlement indeed replacing a non-discriminatory humanitarian approach with a hierarchy of deserving people? So essentially, private sponsorship or community resettlement, one of the curious features of this area is that there is no agreed definition, but everyone agrees that, or most people agree, that it involves some sort of public-private sponsorship. Really, it is a litmus test for the integrity of universal refugee protection. In Asia, for example, I've seen that there are programs operating offering complementary pathways for articulate, clever, middle-class refugees who have come from a background of education for education pathways. Alternatively, community resettlement is being thought of as a form of labour migration, which, as Jane also pointed out, and as we see in countries such as Malaysia, leads to exploitation of so-called refugees. So these are the tensions underlying our inquiry. So concluding, these are the three main ideas of our project, which we will be looking at over the next few years. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope that I have made my points clear. Thank you.
Thanks indeed, Professor Kneeburn. Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating project, and I'm sure in the questions people will be asking you to expand a little bit on some of those kind of three major themes that you've identified and the questions around those. I'm going to move to our third speaker now, which is Dr. Kate Ogg, who is joining us from the Australian National University in Australia. Dr. Ogg is talking to us about community sponsorship literature from the perspective of refugee law scholarship. What is missing? So with that intriguing title, I hand over to you, Kate.
Thank you so much, David. I'm joining you from the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people today here in Canberra, and I want to acknowledge that their sovereignty was never ceded. So Susan and Thea Khan and I first started thinking about doing a project together on community sponsorship in about mid-2018. So all of us have been watching the literature on community sponsorship since at least then. With Khan, it was earlier because he had started on his PhD. So it's been a really interesting literature to watch develop, because when we first started becoming interested in community sponsorship, there were just a handful of publications, and I'm not speaking just in Australia, I'm talking globally. There was minimal literature on community sponsorship. So Khan's PhD really, truly is path-breaking. And now it's grown very, very quickly, and it's now what I would describe as a burgeoning area of scholarship in forced migration. So it started very much with a Canadian focus, looking at Canada's experience with community sponsorship programs. And now there is very much developing a European focused literature on community sponsorship. My sort of big picture observations of the trajectory we've seen is that at first the literature started off quite conceptual. So in particular, there was a project led by Audrey Macklin that focused on notions of citizenship in Canadian community sponsorship programs. And it was also quite empirical. So Macklin's work was empirical, but there were also some other studies looking at the efficacy of community sponsorship programs, especially with respect to integration outcomes. And what we've seen, it's really just sort of been only in the last few years, year or two really, that we've started to see a creep of some more critical literature emerging, and in particular critical literature that really takes issue with the neoliberal nature of a lot of community sponsorship programs, or even just the concept of community sponsorship itself. So I've put a slide here for you that summarizes what I think are the main themes in the sort of emerging community sponsorship literature. I'm not going to speak to each one of them. We'll leave you to read them. Our project is going to engage with each of these themes, with the exception of integration, and that's mainly because in Australia, being a traditional resettlement country, we already have quite a large literature on refugee integration in Australia. I think with some of these themes, the Australian perspective is going to be quite valuable because it's potentially going to provide some different insights to the Canadian and European experience. And I'm happy to discuss that in Q&A if you're interested. What I'm going to focus on instead in this talk is what I see really as the lacunas in the literature. So what are the big gaps in the community sponsorship literature that our project is going to address? And I would encourage those of you who are working on community sponsorship in your national context to think about as well. So the first one, and what's been really interesting to me as a refugee law lawyer watching the development of the scholarship is, there is scholarship on concepts of citizenship in these programs, understanding of sponsors' motivations, but there really isn't anything on what's the idea of refugee protection in these programs, or refuge or sanctuary, you might want to call it. And just to share with you a bit of an anecdote. So I taught refugee law at ANU this year, and one of the students in my class is a former refugee who was resettled to Australia with her family. And I'm sharing this with her permission, of course. And she said to me, you know, when we came here to Australia, every government person we interacted with, every service provider were just stressing to us the need to get into education and to get a job. Like that, they were just the goals that were sort of we were forced into. But she said, we've just come from this incredibly traumatic experience, and we were a young family and we're in a new country, and we just needed to just have a peaceful existence for a while and to heal and to recover from the trauma that we'd been through, and we weren't yet ready to embark on these goals. And I think it would be really interesting. I'm personally really interested in looking at how sponsors themselves, who usually don't come from a refugee resettlement background at all, or from a government background, how they understand refugee protection and what is it that they are perhaps trying to offer. And in particular, in a country like Australia, where the sponsors do come from different faith backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds as well. And also how ideas of refuge or refugee protection are being used by the NGOs involved in this work and government actors themselves, or are these actors still very much dominated by neoliberal thinking? The second big gap in the literature is gender, and that's really unsurprising. Whenever there's sort of a new field or topic that emerges, gender tends to follow behind a little bit. There has been some gender work done in the Canadian context, in particular with respect to who does the sponsoring. There are indications that it is a highly feminized volunteer force in community sponsorship. Professor Jenny Phillimore recently led a global state of knowledge report, and she described gender as a gap that needs to be addressed. And she describes it as the need to apply a gender lens to the experiences of women and girls who are sponsored as refugees. And I completely agree that this fundamental gender analysis needs to be done. But I would also go further and say that there also needs to be a deeper analysis of how community sponsorship as a pathway or potentially as a durable solution is in and of itself gendered. And I was really drawn to a comment in one of Audrey Macklin's recent publications. She said, and I quote, "States depict asylum as a threat to sovereignty and refugee resettlement as sovereignty's benevolent face," end quote. So I think there's a need to draw on feminist thinking, but also twale critical race post-colonial scholarship to critically analyse the ways in which higher income countries are constructing either durable solutions or perhaps better described as migration pathways. Now, linked to this, to gender is the concept of vulnerability. So a lot of community sponsorship programs are saying, you know, we're sponsoring the most vulnerable refugees, or other programs are designed to sponsor vulnerable refugees, but not too vulnerable, because they don't want to put too much of a burden on perhaps inexperienced community sponsors. So I think it's really important to question, well, who are deemed the vulnerable refugees, or the vulnerable but not too vulnerable, and how is this concept of vulnerability being understood and operationalized? There is some emerging research on this question in the resettlement context. In particular, I note DeBoer and Ziek's 2020 publication on this topic, and I think how the idea of vulnerability is being used in the community sponsorship context could provide a really valuable comparison. The fourth gap in the literature I've noticed, and this is, I think, a really crucial one, is what's the appropriate balance between bureaucracy and protection, especially in really urgent situations. So one of the themes that comes across in the community sponsorship literature very strongly is that if there is too much government oversight, if there's too much red tape and community, the sponsors themselves and the NGOs don't have enough autonomy then community sponsorship programs really start to lose all sort of momentum. Sponsors get cynical, sponsors get overworked, and eventually drop out or choose not to sponsor again. But then what we see, of course, and we're seeing this in particular in the UK, is that when there isn't enough government oversight, when there aren't those safety mechanisms, appropriate dispute resolution mechanisms, it can leave people in some very dangerous situations. So the UK, I'm sure most of you are aware, implemented quite an ad hoc and rushed community sponsorship, I wouldn't even call it a program, system in response to the Ukrainian refugee situation. And some Ukrainian refugees have been left homeless because of a dispute perhaps with the family that sponsored with them, or left in really quite unsafe positions. So I think that, how do we get the balance? How do we get the balance between government involvement, bureaucracy, and protection, especially in those really urgent situations? The last point I'll make is scholar positionality. And it might be a slightly controversial one, but in a recent review of the literature by Cortez, she observes that there are more authors in favour of community sponsorship than those who question it. And economistic and humanitarian readings of community sponsorship are eclipsing political and human rights centred interpretations. So I think that there is a need for a critical reflection on the role of academics who are researching community sponsorship, but are in some ways embedded in community sponsorship themselves, either through being a sponsor or through promoting these programs nationally or internationally. I know that reflections on positionality, it's not really a traditional it's not traditional in legal research. It's more commonly seen in the social sciences. But I think in particular, we need to think about and critically think about, and I include myself in this, do we as refugee law scholars adopt different language and different framing when we're discussing community sponsorship as opposed to other topics in the field? Thanks, David.
So just jotting down your last point there. That was a very interesting question, maybe one we can come back to in the discussion. Thanks ever so much, Dr. Ogg, for your presentation about how the body of scholarship has expanded exponentially and what some of the themes through that are. So I'd like to come back to our final speaker. Can I invite Khan to take the stage again? And if you'd like to pick up where you left off last time, that would be great. We're really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Thanks, David. I'll just share my screen again. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, great. I'm really sorry for what happened before. I've done a lot of presentations, but I've never frozen like that, and I'm sure it happens to everyone. So please forgive me for that mishap. But let's try again, and hopefully we'll get somewhere this time. So as I was saying before, my PhD research is looking at the Community Refugee Settlement Scheme, which was established in 1979 as part of Australia's response to the Indo-Chinese refugee crisis. And the scheme was instituted by the government with 4 main aims. The first was to give the community an opportunity to become directly involved in the settlement of refugees and to contribute to their successful integration, to provide for an alternative means of resettlement for refugees who have the capacity to integrate quickly into the Australian community, encourage greater awareness of the Australian government's refugee settlement program, and achieve a more widespread settlement of refugees throughout the Australian community. And these goals, I think, when you look at them, are quite consistent with some of the goals of the recent community sponsorship programs that have popped up around the world. And the CRWS was, as I said before, instituted at a point in time when Australia was ramping up its response to the Indo-Chinese refugee crisis. And there wasn't enough places in government-run migrant hostels where people were initially received for a short period of time to get reorientation. And there was a sense of needing to get more community involvement in the settlement and support of refugees. So what the CRWS allowed government to do was essentially to bypass these migrant centres and allow refugees to become directly settled into the wider Australian community. Sponsorship groups had to essentially apply to be a sponsor with the Australian government and then undertake responsibility for their refugee groups for a period of 12 months. And as I said before, that included everything from education to housing to food to all the things that government would normally provide in terms of settlement for refugees. When that program was instituted in 1979, it expanded very quickly. So by the time we got to 1985, there was some 11,570 refugees had been settled under the CRWS, with over 500 registered sponsorship groups. And these were mainly ethnic and religious groups. I think another point worth noting is that despite the fact that the CRWS came into existence around the same time as the Canadian scheme, there was nothing that I found in the archival research that said that this program was influenced by, or we were in fact trying to copy what the Canadians were doing at that particular time, which is quite interesting when you consider some of the similarities in the mechanisms of the scheme. So, as I said, expanded very quickly by 1985. And then there was a decision made by the Australian Government Immigration Department around 1981, 1982 to essentially allow the program to have a naming component. So when it started, the program was not a named program, which meant that the idea was that the Australian government would pick which refugees to resettle. And then it was the job of the Australian government to essentially match refugees to sponsorship groups. And there was a mechanism to do that through state and territory coordinators throughout Australia. So in each state and territory around Australia, there was a coordinator whose role it was to work with sponsorship groups, and they reported to a national coordinator in the head office in Canberra, whose role it was to oversee the overall policy of the Community Refugee Settlement Scheme. So this decision to allow community sponsorship groups to name a particular individual really changed and shaped the whole trajectory of the scheme, to the point where by 1985, government was really concerned that the CRWS had moved away from essentially what was a tool to help government resettle the refugees it chooses, to being viewed by the community as being essentially a nomination program, or a program in which they could sponsor people for entry into Australia. And this generated a large amount of tension within government, and there was a lot of debate about whether or not the government should, for example, scrap the CRWS altogether, whether naming should be scrapped from the program, which the government could not do at that time, because if it were to do that, all momentum would have been lost, and the government would have lost a lot of goodwill with the Australian community and the sponsors that had already at that point joined the program. This tension was actually never resolved during the life of the CRWS, and all that happened was that government tried to reiterate that the program, or the goal of the program, was to help settle unlinked refugees and not necessarily family reunion or nomination cases. But nothing else was done after that period to change the mechanics of the program in any other way. So when we got to about 1990, 1995, there came increasing reports about the increasing concerns about the CRWS, particularly around the fact that volunteer groups weren't able to cater to the changing refugee profiles that Australia was taking in at the time, particularly because we were receiving refugees with quite high trauma needs. And government was really concerned that these volunteer groups weren't, quote unquote, sort of professional enough to be able to support these refugees in the way that, that the government thought that they needed to be supported. And this really was the critical reason for the de-establishment of the CRWS in 1997, after which Australia then moved to a what you might call a professional service model for refugee settlement, whereby we contract out elements of refugee settlement services to NGOs, rather than relying on volunteer groups that were sponsors under the CRWS. So that just gives you a very brief snapshot, and there's a lot more, obviously, that came out of the research in the archival material. But that essentially is the program from its start to its finish. So what were the strengths of the programs? I think the strength of the CRWS was that it gave sponsorship groups a huge amount of responsibility and relative freedom to conduct sponsorship. And it goes to what Kate was saying before, really about the non-bureaucracy or the lack of bureaucracy in the program, which I actually saw it as a strength rather than as a weakness. Obviously, it allowed the Australian government to expand its protection capacity more greatly. So if you have a look at the stats, between 1985 and 1993, the CRWS accounted for anywhere between 15 and 30% of Australia's overall resettlement intake over that period. So if you think about it, 1 in 5 refugees who were resettled to Australia over that period were supported through the Community Refugee Settlement Scheme. It created space for volunteers to be involved in settlement of refugees with seemingly good integration outcomes. There were 2 or 3 government-initiated reviews of the CRWS over its lifetime, and these were point-in-time evaluations that involved interviews with volunteers, sponsors, and refugees. And all of those reports demonstrated that the CRWS was achieving good integration outcomes for refugees. Some of the weaknesses of the program were the lack of monitoring and evaluation, particularly towards the latter end of the program, as I said, and that's what really caused government to essentially lose confidence in the program, because they weren't able to see whether or not refugees were achieving the kinds of outcomes that they were achieving at the start of the program, especially when those profiles of refugees changed. And that need for more intensive trauma support wasn't necessarily being delivered by volunteer sponsorship groups. I think the failure to resolve that tension between family reunion and unlinked cases was a troubling aspect of the CRWS right through its program. And I think that meant that government didn't necessarily want to perhaps invest as much as they could have, because they were still, I think, quite concerned about losing control, quote unquote, of the resettlement program. And I think this raises some really interesting questions about how much government is willing to give to sponsorship and to the community when instituting a community sponsorship program. And then the last weakness, I think, was the lack of support from the government for volunteer sponsorship base as the refugee resettlement profiles changed. And then that really was the point that led to the demise of the CRWS. So to finish up, what has the experience of the CRWS meant for us in terms of contemporary practice in Australia? I think one of the really important questions to ask going forwards is how do we rebuild and sustain a volunteer base that will support a community sponsorship program going forward? And I think it's interesting that the CRIPS program is now in place, the pilot, because to me that looks essentially like a CRWS. You're going back to trying to build a volunteer base, going back to trying to increase the amount of unlinked cases that are coming through sponsorship rather than through family reunification. The related point there is about the relationship between community sponsorship and other complementary pathways in family reunion. I think that's a really important point for us to consider in terms of where does community sponsorship now sit with all the other pathways and family reunion pathways possible in Australia, particularly when you look at the CSP and its emphasis on integration-ready refugees. So where does community sponsorship sit within the broader suite of durable solutions that a state might offer? The third point there is around the importance of monitoring and evaluation. And obviously what we saw with the CRWS was government losing confidence in the scheme because it didn't have information that essentially gave it confidence that the scheme was achieving the aims that it was intended to achieve. So I think that constant monitoring and evaluation is going to be really important going forwards to keep government interested and to keep government wanting to contribute more to community sponsorship. And lastly, I think a really important question is, how do we make the program scale, and can it scale quickly? And what we saw with the CRWS was, as it started to scale, that family reunion aspect of it really reared its head in and kind of derailed the initial purpose of the scheme. And we saw this, we see this happen with the Canadian model as well, in terms of it quickly coming to being a sort of family reunion program. So again, I think if we want to scale, we've got to think about what does that look like, and how do we address family reunion within an expanded community sponsorship program. Thanks a lot.
Many thanks indeed, Khan. I think your presentation raises really a number of very important questions. And one of those is the value that it brings because of the historical approach. You know, there's been this resurgence of interest in this area of community sponsorship, but taking a historical study allows us to see how these issues play out longitudinally, if you like. And I think that that's a really valuable contribution to the debate and the thinking on this area. So we've reached the end of the 4 presentations. I can see you've sparked a good deal of questions in the comment box. We've got just over 20 minutes left. So I think what might be a suitable way of proceeding is if we take all of the questions now and give you each about 4 or 5 minutes to respond to them. I'm going to start with a kind of broad question, and that is, what do you think the gap is that community sponsorship fills? So what's the gap in the refugee regime that community sponsorship fills, and does it fill it adequately? Is it the best response to that gap that we could be creating, or should we be thinking of other areas really? And secondarily, I think all of your presentations have raised a really interesting question, you know, community sponsorship, but what's the role of community? You know, Khan, you were talking very much about, you know, the tensions between community-based and professionalization drives within this. You know, what is the community in all of this? What are what do we consider to be the community? What role should they play? For those of us who work in the social sciences, the idea of, you know, community being a sort of homogenous positive force is something that's relatively open to critique. I mean, does community, you know, bringing questions about choice, about matching, about ultimately differentiation in treatment between different nationalities of refugees, or reflect the kinds of fissures and tensions that are reflected in particular diaspora communities? So I think that, or even local communities, if you look at the Ukraine resettlement in the UK. So I think a second question is, you know, what does it mean to have the word community in the sponsorship? Moving on to the other participants' questions, we've got one here asking, under what conditions could community sponsorship be considered a genuine form of resettlement? For instance, if it would only accept UNHCR referrals. So again, a question there, thinking sort of more broadly in the global refugee regime context about how these things relate to other pathways. Professor Kneebones asked, made a comment. One question which Khan's presentation raises, one of the inspirations for our project is this: why did Canada and Australia diverge so radically on community sponsorship after similar Indochina experiences? I mean, I suspect that may be a question for our historian on the panel, but if others would like to come in as well, you're very welcome to do so. Got a question here actually from the UK. In the UK, worrying signs that the government's hostile agenda actually depends upon it being able to show its benevolence to the few thousand that are being resettled. do the panelists have any ideas about how we can make sure community resettlement does not end up reinforcing the good refugee, bad asylum seeker queue jumper narrative? And one here from the perspective, I think, of migration pathways. A question to all of you: do you see the AU community sponsorship programs? Is that Australia or African Union? Community sponsorship programs also as a form of work-related community sponsorships, which can serve as an alternative of labour migration-based complementary pathways. I see this trend in Canada, where sponsors are often employers or have links to owners of companies and provide immediate access to work for the sponsored refugees. And sorry, that's Australian rather than African Union. Thanks for the clarification. Okay, so I'm going to go in the order that the presenters are listed on the programme. So if you would like to you don't have to answer all of those questions. If you'd like to take your pick of them and respond to those that you feel your research suitably addresses. So first of all, Dr. Vogel, over to you. You have 5 minutes.
Thanks so much, David, and to the participants for such excellent and engaging questions. I will jump in with the last one, and I'm sure we all have thoughts across all of them, but I'll add a couple of thoughts to that last point about the relationship between, and something that Khan raised as well, the relationship between other forms of complementary pathways and the way in which community sponsorship pathways are understood. I mean, I think what that question raises is a really important kind of consideration, and a question that I think as scholars and people engaged in any form of sponsorship we have to attend to, which is, you know, how do we draw the line between alternative or complementary pathways and community sponsorship, and is it indeed important and required that we draw that line and we make some form of distinction? I think in our work and our collective thinking on this, it is incredibly important because of the ways in which community sponsorship is at least still held out to be a form of refugee resettlement that is open to humanitarian applicants that may not be able to meet the requirements of the other alternative pathways or complementary pathways as they're articulated. That having been said, I think the CSP in Australia, so the current program, is a really good example of the blurring of those lines. So the requirement of it's not just that someone might be employable. I mean, it's quite restrictive criteria that you have a job offer in Australia or that you're able to get one quickly. And again, some of my critique of these requirements is, of course, the capaciousness of these terms. I mean, what does it mean to get a job quickly in Australia? Who's to say? But these criteria being imposed on potential humanitarian entrants into Australia, and I think it looks like a labour migration pathway, and has been treated as one by the mediating NGOs deciding whether or not humanitarian entrants are eligible to come in under those programs. So in some of my research, I have been interviewing those APOs about how refugee entrants are selected under the CSP, and that is absolutely a critical step in preparing an application, that kind of sense of employability. And just one last thing to add, certainly the Australian government, when the CSP was introduced on that question and the comparison with Canada with the idea that sponsors are companies or employers, the Australian government was very keen on the idea of corporate participation in the sponsorship program. So that was some of the framing, the idea that big business might get involved in refugee resettlement. And again, really interesting to think about the ways in which kind of ideas about privatisation and the appeal of kind of privatisation and economic rationalism as such really slots into the promotion of sponsorship programs by government. Not all governments, but certainly by the Australian government when it's introduced. I have some thoughts about the other questions, but I don't want to take up too much airtime. So maybe we can do a round and come back if there's time.
Well, you still have a minute and a half if you want to take a quick start at one of the others.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the one that really speaks to my research and in this area and other research is that question around the way in which sponsorship seems to, again, reify the idea of a very assimilable and good refugee. And really, I think that the question really correctly raises the ways in which sponsorship immediately conjures up the idea of a refugee whom states like, and the idea that states like refugees who are able-bodied, of a certain age, that gender and employability comes into that. And the question asks, how do we ward against this? I mean, I think in some ways, engaging very critically in the ways in which sponsorship is being rolled out is how we ward against it. And coming back to the end of Kate's presentation and the really excellent question that she posed, part of the reason, I think some of the enthusiasm around community sponsorship is because of the lack of durable solutions available and the resettlement gap that we all talk about, and the huge numbers of refugees who are not afforded genuine pathways to resettlement. And so part of the enthusiasm is the idea that we are creating resettlement places, but I think that must come with a degree of caution and a real commitment to the humanitarian, a critique indeed of the humanitarian principles as they operate in the refugee regime. So I don't think we should imagine that kind of the existing convention and the way it operates is perfect or wonderful, but in kind of engaging that process of critique of the history of the refugee regime itself, that we don't then kind of celebrate private sponsorship. I know as an Australian refugee law scholar, the inclination is to be kind of relieved that there's finally something that seems to be a positive development in the space of kind of refugee resettlement in Australia. But as all of the panelists have highlighted, I think there's reason to be very cautious around the ways in which we celebrate or valorise sponsorship as a solution to some of the great question that David asked, and I might leave it to other panelists about what is the problem that sponsorship is responding to? What's the gap, and is it the best response? Which I think is a great question. So I'll hand over.
Thanks, Dr. Vogel. And of course, one of the key distinctions between the convention sponsorship is discretion. States have a large degree of discretion. They like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
On that happy point, I shall turn to our historian on the panel, who has certainly one question on history and no doubt thoughts on a number of the other points. Mr. Huang, over to you for your intervention. You've got 5 minutes.
Thanks a lot. I think on Susan's question of why did the Australian experience diverge so much from Canada, given that we had similar experiences with the Indo-Chinese crisis. I mean, to me, I think I asked the question of what would have happened if the Australian government didn't push back so hard on these so-called name cases and kind of just allowed the community to sponsor more or as many refugees as they could, or as many as the capacity allowed, in the same way in which the Canadian model had always allowed naming. I think we might have seen, the sponsorship explode, maybe not in the same way. Conditions certainly were different across the two countries, but I think that would have made quite a significant change to the way in which the CRWS rolled out. Other than that, I think it's difficult to point to any other particular point that would really explain the differences in divergence. I really do think it was quite interesting that there was no reference to the Canadian program that I found in the archival material. That's not to say that perhaps somewhere along the way, the Canadian program did influence the way in which ours was shaped or formed, but there wasn't anything that I found that pointed to that. I think another interesting point worth raising is going back to what Anthony was saying about sort of the desirable refugee. What I found also interesting about the CRWS when you compare it to the modern iterations of community sponsorship was actually that part of the CRWS was really about the Australian government giving priority to what they call doubly disadvantaged refugees. And this included, for example, the disabled, single men or unaccompanied minors or children. And the CRWS saw community sponsorship as being a way in which to give greater assistance and protection to people that actually needed it. When you compare that to the CSP is actually asking us to sponsor refugees who, in fact, on paper, don't need much community sponsorship or support at all, because they come integration ready, they're job ready, they're English, they've got high English proficiency and so on. And so I think what was interesting about the CRWS was that it catered for both ends of the spectrum, both in terms of people that were, you know, quote unquote integration ready, but also those more vulnerable people who the community really had a role to play and support during the life of the CRWS.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that intervention and taking the head-on point about history so eloquently as well. So I'm moving on to our third speaker, that is Professor Kneebone. You've got a range of questions there. You have 4 to 5 minutes to respond.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Well, just building on from Khan's response, I want to go back into the history of Australian resettlement back to the post-war period. And at that time, there was a deliberate attempt to try and engage the community, which kind of failed because it was mainly the religious groups that were interested in the issues. And so I think there is some disjuncture between what was happening with the Good Neighbour Councils and the citizenship conventions and the way that Australian policy towards refugees and forced migration was developing. And so we came up with this very hard-fisted model eventually, but there are lots of interesting questions there. So there was a very good question about the idea of a genuine form of resettlement. Would only UNHCR referrals satisfy a proper model of private or community sponsorship? Well, I'd like to first of all question that there is any genuine form of resettlement in existence. I think that one of the issues with resettlement is that it is a solution or a remedy that is used by states strategically and has been for a long time. And indeed, the Indochina War was the period in which states in Southeast Asia, for example, became very cynical about the whole international refugee regime. They saw it as responsibility of the West. But the West has always been incredibly selective, and I see that community sponsorship as it's been developing in Australia and still developing is as not being a genuine form of resettlement at all. I think we need to go back to the historical roots of resettlement, which I have written about with Audrey Macklin in the Oxford Handbook recently. So I'm not sure that only UNHCR referrals would indeed be satisfactory, because I think there is a role for community. I think this is something that is very clear in Australia's history. When you look at Australia's history of migration policy and particularly multiculturalism, and you look at some of the reports that are put out at the time in the 70s and 80s about multiculturalism and the heads of libraries and museums wanting to celebrate our ethnicity and diversity, there's a whole disjuncture between what the community wanted and what government wanted. So I think we need to correct the balance sheet on that. So there is this enduring question of whether this is a question of a partnership or sponsorship. And Australia has a huge experience of sponsorship, even before the CRSS. We've been really good at it all along. So none of these questions can be answered simply, and the community obviously falls into different sectors, but from some of the focus groups that I have observed, the community is very willing to help. The business community is less convinced, but there are certainly many groups out there, suburban groups, not necessarily people wanting to help people of the same ethnicity, but just Australians who want to see more people in need resettled in the country. So those are the sorts of things that we want to explore. So I think probably that is my time is up.
Many thanks indeed, Professor Kneebone, for your intervention. We come to our last speaker then. Dr. Ogg, you've got 4 to 5 minutes to address those questions, or indeed to come back on this point of, why do we need a different framing for community sponsorship research as opposed to other topics? So take your pick and off you go.
Thanks. So your first question, David, what gap does it fill? I thought that was such a great one. And I've got sort of two responses. One, basically, it's a very small gap, if any gap at all, and one could be really significant. So going back to this, you know, it doesn't really fill a gap at all, or maybe just a small one. I mean, we all know the numbers. We all know the numbers of people displaced. We all know that it is lower income countries, middle income countries who are doing the greatest share of the hosting of these refugees, and countries like Australia do such a, you know, such a small part of caring for refugees in comparison. And this sort of comes back to my point about positionality of scholars. When you're in these sort of events celebrating community sponsorship, it's hard not to feel really uncomfortable, because, you know, there's a lot of celebration about, oh, what a, you know, great program this is, and so much work and effort has gone into it. And you say, in the bigger scheme of things, and of course, I don't mean to denigrate the people involved at all, you know, especially the sponsors who've really given up their precious, valuable time to do this. And I have no doubt that they've had very meaningful impacts on people's lives in doing so. But I think in the greater scheme of things, it's such a small contribution to a massive problem. So it's hard not to feel really uncomfortable and cynical sometimes. But then from the opposite perspective, I think it could possibly, maybe, and there's a bit of a game changer. And there's some assumptions in the literature, not Australian literature, global literature, that maybe this could be one of the keys to convincing countries, in particular higher income countries, to have more progressive, more protection sensitive policies towards refugees. So that's the assumption, and it's an untested assumption. It was interesting, a few years ago, I went to sort of an Amnesty International sponsored event on community sponsorship, and it was very clear that the actors in that event were really using community sponsorship as a tool to try and convince ordinary Australians, whoever that is, to understand refugees' plight, background, and not just come on board and be a community sponsor, but to pressure the Australian government to change its policies more broadly on immigration detention, on pushbacks, on offshore processing. So I think this is a really important question to test. I mean, can community sponsorship have this game-changing effect? Can it? And I think Australia is the perfect really litmus test to do that in, because this relates to a question we had in chat, which I think is a good one, the good refugee. We've had that rhetoric in Australia for so long about queue jumpers and the people who come here the right way and the people who jump the queue. And there is a real danger, I think, in community sponsorship programs and the way that they're promoted and they're discussed and they're managed in the public about actually reinforcing that dichotomy. These are the good refugees who have waited patiently in camps for us to come and invite them here. So we're still supportive of, and this is very much the Labor government's position. You know, it is a less conservative party than the Liberals, but you know, that it almost justifies policies like offshore processing and immigration detention. It makes, I did do a little bit of interviewing with UK sponsors that got sort of disrupted because of COVID. And one thing that was sort of interesting that came through, it made me think of Michael Ignatieff's work on ordinary virtues. So the question of why are you doing this? You know, why are you giving up your, you know, incredibly precious time to do this? And, you know, I never heard human rights or refugee rights really mentioned at all. It was this idea of, I just want to do something. I just want to be involved and doing something. And this was very much in the Syrian context. Role of community. I think in some of the, I've spoken for 4 minutes already. That's really bad. I've got 5 minutes, haven't I? You can stop me when you think I should stop.
45 seconds, yeah.
45 seconds. Role of community, where I think you do see a community as locality a lot in community sponsorship because of the need to provide housing. But what's sort of interesting, I think sometimes is some communities, sponsorship groups are very much faith-based, and others are really rejecting of faith-based and don't want to get involved in any sort of, you know, don't want the faith groups in that community involved. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic to explore. There was a question about work and sponsorship through work. The other, I'd just like to raise the other sort of issue to think about is through universities. So Canada does have a really interesting university refugee sponsorship program. In the Australian context, we don't have anything formal like the Canadians do. Some universities are starting to come on board in a public way, and other Australian universities are coming on board and starting to get both scholars and students to Australia who are in need of protection, but they're doing it on the down low in a it's deliberately very silent, very quiet way. So there we go.
Well, many thanks, Dr. Ogg, for your final intervention from the panel. And drawing the panel together, I came as an ad hoc chair knowing nothing about community sponsorship in Australia. I feel that I've learned a great deal about community sponsorship in general and in Australia particularly. And I think from the questions that you've had, you've sparked a great deal of interest in this topic. I can see there's even a final comment in the chat about the Chilean refugee case and community sponsorship. I'm sure I join with all of the other participants in wishing you the very best for your upcoming projects, and hopefully we will see some of the answers to these questions which have been posed in the chat and amongst yourselves as well. 4 really fantastic presentations, but let's draw this session to a close now.